It's the summer of 2021. I had just finished watching the Netflix series Outer Banks. In the second season of the show, which was the last season of the show I bothered to watch, our ensemble cast of characters searches for the buried treasure that belonged to a freed black named Denmark Tanny. Tanny's mythos in the show's universe is as follows. Having survived a shipwreck near the coast of the Outer Banks, Tanny scavenged the wreck for gold and used that gold to free himself from bondage. He then started a church for enslaved people and free people of color, using his quite literally newfound riches, becoming both a hero for those held in chains and a villain to those who tightened those chains. After his wife and child were murdered by their enslavers, Tanny himself was killed when he tried to bury their bodies in a dignified manner. This became the source of the supernatural element of the show's treasure hunt plot. It's quite a shocking twist in the show's story, not for its addition to the actual plot, but for introducing a frankly dark and all too real historical narrative to what is a rather poorly written bubblegum teen drama. The reason I bring up all this is that the story of Denmark Tanny is almost a one-to-one Wikipedia-level synopsis of the story of Denmark Vesey. Vesey's story is something that has fascinated me since I had learned about it right after watching Outer Banks. Even as a 15-year-old kid, I was blown away by the fact that Vesey had flown under the historical radar in my state education classes in middle school or my United States history classes in high school. Though, owing to where I grew up, right here in Clemson, South Carolina, I could almost guarantee that Vesey's omission from the history books is by design rather than historical irrelevance. However, that's a whole different can of worms. Denmark Vesey is a historical anomaly. For allegedly leading such a publicized and impactful slave insurrection, there is still to this day a great debate surrounding whether or not Vesey was a fire-breathing terrorist, a community leader in over his head, or a black man framed for the advancement of white supremacy. In this exploration of Vesey's story, I want to assess both historical arguments being made against Vesey. The first argument being Vesey abetted, encouraged, and planned an insurrection for the slaves against their masters in the Charleston area, or that Vesey's status as a free black man made him a target of white scapegoating, with his execution and subsequent crackdowns on enslaved people in the southern states a coordinated effort rather than a circumstantial and rash decision. Before we can understand how Vesey ended up the martyr of another failed slave rebellion, we must first understand his life before that fateful revolution in 1822. A deeply unfortunate aspect of Vesey's life is that most of the narrative was not written or recorded in any way by his own volition. In an article for the New York Times about Vesey, Ira Berlin of the University of Maryland noted, "Most of what we know is filtered through Vesey's enemies, who were happy to send him to the gallows, doubtless after hours of torture. Thankfully, just enough bits and pieces are out there to tell a somewhat comprehensive tale." I popped over to the Cooper Library here at Clemson and checked out the trial record recorded by Thomas Parker and Lionel H. Kennedy. Parker and Kennedy were both prominent Charlestonian lawyers at the time of the trial and composed the narrative of Vesey's life. In this record, they note that Captain Joseph Vesey commanded a slave ship which picked up to close to 400 slaves in the year 1781. During this particular voyage to the island of St. Thomas, Vesey was, quote, struck with the beauty, alertness, and intelligence of a boy about 14 years of age. The young boy, nicknamed Telemaque by Joseph and his officers, was known for his clever and cunning ways of deceiving the planter he was delivered to by Joseph. Parker and Kennedy claim, quote, the planter who had purchased him represented him unsound and subject to epileptic fits. Indeed, this claim is corroborated by Douglas Egerton in his book He Shall Go Out Free, The Many Lives of Denmark Vesey. Egerton writes, he, Joseph, was surprised to learn that his former pet, who had displayed no signs of epilepsy during the voyage from St. Thomas, was unwell and had to be repurchased. He retained the child even when the epileptic fits ceased as quickly as they had begun. Instead of selling young Telemaque back to the infinitely more brutal Saint-Domingue slave society, where French overseers, quote, prided themselves on being accomplished cutters able to wield their whips so they flayed the skins of their victims into neat ribbons, Telemaque sailed the world with Joseph Vesey as the captain's cabin boy. For 20 years, Captain Vesey toured young Telemaque as they traversed the Atlantic slave trade. Ira Berlin writes, Denmark became fluent in English, French, Spanish, and perhaps other tongues, conversant with the Bible, and skilled at carpentry and knowledgeable of the larger events transforming the world. Telemaque was said to have bragged of his travels, and as Berlin conceded, he was a most cosmopolitan slave. In 1783, Joseph Vesey settled in Charleston or retired from his active role in slave trading. Telemaque would remain by his side, and the Vesey family moved into a house on King Street. There, according to Egerton, Telemaque discovered that Charleston's back alleys and hidden courts concealed a thriving black community. In Charleston, community existed outside of the home, on the street corners, in the church basements, and in the illicit networks of goods and information. From the start of his time living in urban Charleston, young Telemaque engrossed himself in the community. As he grew older, his influence would only grow. Almost a decade after Vesey and Telemaque settled in Charleston in 1791, a slave revolt in Saint Domingue led to the total overthrow of the French slave society, the first ever free black state in the Western Hemisphere. Under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the free mulattoes of Haiti helped to free and arm their enslaved African brethren. This slave revolution caused great panic amongst Charlestonian whites. As Egerton noted, the only solution for Charlestonians was, quote, the expulsion of all blacks who arrived from Saint Domingue in 1791. Indeed, in 1803, the state assembly banned, quote, any person of color, whether bond or free, from entering South Carolina if they had previously resided in, quote, any of the French West India Islands. On December 31st, 1799, as Charleston was ringing in the new century, Denmark Vesey handed May Vesey, wife of Joseph, $600. In return, she gave Vesey his freedom papers. After entering the East Bay lottery, his winning ticket number of 1884 netted him $1,500. With that money and the generosity of the Vesey family, of course, as much generosity that could be extended to a slave after 20 years of servitude, Denmark Vesey purchased his freedom. The name Denmark was a callback to the roots historians are still trying to unravel to this day. The trial record of Vesey stated by gradual corruption among the Negroes, Telemaque changed his name to Denmark. According to the South Carolina Encyclopedia entry on Vesey, because he intended to stay in Charleston and learn carpentry, he adopted the surname Vesey, which was well known among the white businessmen who would be his main clients as the city expanded north of the peninsula. Denmark also may have been a self-ascribed moniker, harkening back to his home island of St. Thomas, a Danish slave colony. Whatever the origins may be, Vesey's name was soon to become known amongst all Charlestonians. After securing his freedom, Vesey would become an influential figure in the African-American community of Charleston. His religiosity was something that became of utmost importance to his lifestyle. Having learned the teachings of Christ from Captain Vesey, Denmark was much more critical in his interpretation of Scripture. As was a custom at the time, slaves were often taught the New Testament, and specifically the verses pertaining to the obedience and servitude of a master. After all, if the all-knowing God commands it, then it must be followed. But Vesey took a wildly different approach and much more controversial view of religion than his fellow mixed-race freedmen. As William, a slave testifying against him at his trial, remarked, he studied the Bible a great deal and tried to prove from it that slavery and bondage is against the Bible. While the mulatto caste of Charleston was content with going to the same churches as their masters, typically Episcopalian or Methodist, Vesey sought something that could help provide hope for those enslaved as he was. First, he had to infiltrate from within. According to Douglas Egerton, quote, in mid-April 1817, Vesey was one of, quote, 3 people of color admitted to the commune for the first time at the Second Presbyterian Church. Yet the pro-slavery justifications clanging off the hollowed walls of Charleston churches caused Vesey to most assuredly be aghast. As Egerton wrote in an article for the South Carolina Historic magazine, even the trappings of his chosen faith served to remind him of his second-class status, as segregated seating for people of color was standard in Charleston churches. Fed up and bitter, Vesey and a charismatic preacher named Morris Brown worked to establish the first predominantly black church in Charleston. In 1817, the cornerstone of Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church was laid. Over 4,000 Africans, free and enslaved, followed Brown and Vesey to this new church. From the very beginning, the church became the target of the draconian slave society laws of Charleston. As Douglas Egerton wrote in an article for the New Republic, the church's ministers allowed Vesey to teach reading and writing, which violated the state's ban on black literacy, leading Charleston authorities to repeatedly shut the church down. Just over a year into the church's history, a white mob stormed the church one Sunday and arrested 140 free Negroes and slaves. Similar shakedowns occurred in 1820 and 1821, with church officials being sentenced to fines and lashes if they didn't comply with the city. In response to this, Vesey abandoned all teachings of the New Testament in favor of the fire and brimstone God of the Old Testament. One article from a PBS series on abolitionist figures remarked, An angry Vesey began preaching from the Old Testament, particularly Exodus, and taught followers that they were the new Israelites, the chosen people whose enslavement God would punish with death. The teaching of the Israelites' emancipation from the Pharaoh only served to make whites more fearful of Vesey and put a greater target on his back. The seed was planted in the minds of slaves. Now it was up to Vesey to nurture it. In 1820, the South Carolina Assembly enacted a law that required their approval for any slave seeking freedom. This not only made the binds of slavery tighten on over half the state's population at the time, but added a wrinkle to freedom that was previously not even a part of the process. Vesey, who more than almost any other free black in Charleston, had a finger on the pulse of the community. Fashioning himself a black Moses, Vesey began to recruit for his rebellion. As Egerton writes in He Shall Go Free, quote, "Until the last minute, his army of God needed officers, not soldiers. Having resolved to select only a few lieutenants, none of them mulattoes, and all of them members of the African Church, his choices were obvious: Peter Poyas, Rolla Bennett, Monday Gell, and Jack Pritchard. Shortly afterwards, Ned Bennett, a fellow slave along Rolla, joined the conspiracy." Jack Pritchard in particular was a man that white Charlestonians in the wake of the failed rebellion came to lampoon and revile. Nicknamed Gullah Jack, he was known for, quote, his great degree of influence over the African-American community due to his connections within the church, his perceived spiritual authority as a healer, and his memorable physical appearance. He was remembered as having large whiskers. Another biography of Jack stated, quote, "He exerted immense sway over the black population because of his role as a magician, conjurer, or doctor." Gullah Jack was a hired-out slave, meaning he lived outside the city limits with his master Paul Pritchard. Because of this, Gullah Jack moved freely throughout Charleston, allowing him to recruit potential members to the insurgency. The Bennett boys were property of Thomas Bennett, then governor of South Carolina. Rolla and Ned were lodged at the governor's house on Lynch Street, just 2 blocks away from the residency of Denmark Vesey, who lived on Bull Street. Because of this, quote, both Bennett's slaves readily acquiesced in Vesey's schemes. Poyas and Gell provided skills to rally potential slaves who were hell-bent on breaking their chains. According to Egerton, Gell, quote, an Igbo, knew the African men who worked the fields across the rivers, but traveled to the city to market their wares. Poyas was, quote, popular among the skilled blacks who labored along the waterfront. With such a confluence of differing relationships, the 5 original conspirators were able to disseminate their plans to a wide audience. Unfortunately, some in that audience turned against them. The planned date for the insurrection was set as July 14th, 1822, the 33rd anniversary of the storming of the Bastille by French revolutionaries. Vesey's plan was as follows, quote, Peter was to lead one group to seize an arsenal and guardhouse. Ned was to lead another from a country house. Rolla was to lead another, which, after killing the governor and the intendant, would march through Charleston to prevent whites coming from Cannonsboro from entering the city. A 4th party from the country and partly from Charleston was to meet at Gadsden's Wharf and attack the upper guardhouse. A 5th, consisting of country and neck blacks, was to assemble at Bulkey's farm, 2.5 miles from the city, seize the powder magazine there, and then march into the city. A 6th, under Vesey's command, was to march to the guardhouse. The seizure of weapons and gunpowder was directly inspired by the storming of the Bastille. Luckily for Vesey, Charleston had had many different gunneries around the city, almost all of which were insufficiently guarded. Once the weapons were ready, Vesey planned on holding out in the city just long enough to secure some kind of vessel to sail to Haiti. As Rolla Bennett testified after the fact, some of the company asked if they were to stay in Charleston. He said no. As soon as they could get the money from the banks and the goods from the stores, they should hoist sails for Santo Domingo. Mimicking the slave rebellion of Haiti, Vesey hoped to enact retributive violence on white Charlestonians. As Smart, a slave owned by Robert Anderson, told the courts, I asked Vesey if he was going to kill all the women and children. Denmark answered, what was the use of killing the louse and leaving the nit? Vesey's plan was only around a month away from fruition when 2 separate leaks occurred. While recruiting slaves near the market wharf, William Paul approached Peter, a slave owned by John C. Prelue. While shooting the breeze, Paul mentioned the plans of Peter, a mulatto cook and domestic servant, that Vesey advised his followers to avoid recruiting. Peter lambasted William. Egerton writes in He Shall Be Free, Peter curtly told William that he did not understand such talk and stopped the conversation. Although he attempted to warn Peter to silence, the slave told his master 5 days later of the conspiracy. Similarly, George Wilson, another mixed-race domestic servant, was informed of the plot by Rolla Bennett. Wilson, a devout Christian who believed that God required him to love his master, begged and pleaded with Bennett to call off the plot. 5 days after this, he too confessed to Governor Bennett. From there, everything came crashing down for Denmark Vesey. The mayor of Charleston, James Hamilton, put the city on high alert, and roving white militias soon captured many of the alleged perpetrators. Vesey, Rolla and Ned Bennett, Peter Poyas, and later Gullah Jack, alongside 131 others, were all charged with conspiracy to incite a slave insurrection. The preceding trials came under great scrutiny from an unlikely source, Governor Thomas Bennett. Despite 3 of his slaves being a part of the plot, Bennett was fearful that the speed in which the men were found guilty damaged the reputation of South Carolina. He is quick to point out many of the issues regarding the trials. The court, quote, closed its doors upon the community. Bennett continued saying it was embarrassing, quote, that the accused should be convicted and sentenced to death without seeing the persons or hearing the voices of those who testified to their guilt. Governor Bennett's efforts to ensure a fair and just trial were in vain. Mayor James Hamilton celebrated the capture of the conspirators and attributed such to the city's whites. By playing on this newfound sense of relief the city's whites were feeling, Hamilton published a 46-page pamphlet exalting the efforts of the white citizenry. As Lacey Ford wrote in an article about Hamilton's schemes, Hamilton presented the public with an overview of the insurrection diametrically opposed to Bennett's. The intendant painted a picture of a bloodbath narrowly avoided by bold and timely action by city and state authorities, and of relentless investigation that carefully and impartially followed every lead to its end. The trial of Denmark Vesey and his other 130 conspirators would transpire as expected. Along with 34 others, Vesey was hanged just outside the city limits of Charleston shortly after the trial. 67 of his fellow conspirators would be exiled, one of whom was his son Sandy Vesey. 4 white men were also tried and convicted for their involvement in the slave plot, with the courts rendering fines and jail time to those 4 men. In the aftermath of the plot, James Hamilton set his sights on a new target. He blamed the Mother Emanuel AME Church for being, quote, a hotbed in which the germ of insurrection might well be expected to spring into life and vigor. With his vehement riling up of the people, Charlestonian whites burned down the church in late 1822, expelling the free black members like Morris Brown back to Philadelphia. The story of Denmark Vesey is seemingly cut and dry. A free black man with immense sway amongst his community and religiously misguided, according to those who condemned him to death, planned an all-encompassing retaliatory insurrection against the white-dominated slave society of Charleston. However, 2 historians named Richard C. Wade and Michael P. Johnson contend that Vesey was not only innocent, but framed by Charleston's elites and made a scapegoat to worsen the condition of African Americans in the Low Country. Richard C. Wade initiated the first battle against the long-held historical narrative of Vesey's life. Wade published in 1964 an article entitled The Vesey Plot, A Reconsideration. Can we just take a moment and acknowledge that at the very height of racial tensions in the 1960s, Richard C. Wade had the gall to question the history of a figure so thoroughly vilified and labeled a terrorist among Southern aristocratic whites? For reference, the Mississippi burning murders would only occur a month after Wade published this article. That's the climate he is introducing his thesis into. His argument is predicated on the fact that much of the testimony acquired by the court was with the threat of death looming over the defendants. Wade points out, quote, the tribunal quickly drew up its rules. No slave could be tried without the presence of his owner or the owner's counsel. The trial was held in, quote, complete secrecy due to the peculiar nature of the investigations. Due to the threat of death, many blacks implicated in the plot were quick to give up their comrades. Monday Gale, Charles Drayton, and Harry Haig, 3 men closely associated with Vesey and Gullah Jack, quickly testified in hopes of leniency. Even the judges in the case admitted as much. As Wade describes, quote, the judges described the conditions of their testimony. Under the impression that they could ultimately have their lives spared, they made disclosures not only important in detection of the general plot of the conspiracy, but enabling the court to convict a number of principal offenders. Wade is suggesting that due to the threat of death, the slaves caught up in the web of the law, and more crucially under the watchful eye of their masters in court, hastily blamed the actions of a few rather than a widespread contingent of jaded slaves. In exchange for their testimony, these slaves would be exiled rather than subjected to the noose. Indeed, Monday jail, one of the first 5 lieutenants of Denmark Vesey, was merely exiled from the state after his trial. Wade's article also breaks down the frankly incomparable evidence of the large weapon caches said to have been slowly built up by Vesey and his conspirators during the planning stages of their plot. The official trial record recorded by Thomas Parker and Lionel Kennedy notes, a Negro who was a blacksmith and had been accustomed to making edged tools was employed to make pike heads and bayonets with sockets to be fixed at the end of long poles and used as pikes. According to Parker and Kennedy, witnesses attest that Gullah Jack was said to be in possession of 6 pike heads when he was apprehended. But as Wade emphasizes in his writings, the pikes were never located, thereby forcing the court into a curious logic. Quote, as those 6 pike heads had not been found, there is no reason for disbelieving the testimony of there having been more made. The trial record exclaims that as many as 200 pike heads have been made, with 400 daggers also being made quickly by this inhumanly productive enslaved blacksmith. But Wade, in my view, correctly asserts how ridiculous this notion was even for the circumstances of the trial. Except for those few individual weapons found on some of the earliest captured conspirators, no arms caches were uncovered. The judges concluded, quote, to presume that the insurgents had no arms because none were seized would be drawing an inference in direct opposition to the whole of the evidence. Of course, that evidence is that of witness testimonies painstakingly obtained through coercion and the threat of death by the gallows. Finally, Wade is quite possibly the first historian to question the legitimacy of the trial record itself. Though composed with the express goal of capturing the trial as it proceeded, there are glaring omissions between the records that could be found in the library, like the one I am using currently, and the original manuscript. Bacchus Hammett, a slave under the threat of death, is recorded in the trial record as stating, quote, at Vesey's they wanted to make a collection to make the pikes for the country people, but the men had no money. In the original manuscript, Hammett remarked, Denmark told me in March he was getting arms fast. About 150 to 200 pikes were made, and there was a great deal of money placed in his hands for the purpose. Hammett is also recorded naming various accomplices. Parker and Kennedy note Hammett told the court, quote, Belial Yates, I have seen at meetings, and Adam Yates, and Napham Yates, and Dean Mitchell, and Caesar Smith, and George Astavador. However, when examining the confession of Hammett, one of the few slave confessions that survived the trial, Wade points out, quote, some passages were omitted, facts not mentioned in the original interrogation were added, even the tone of the narrative was changed with the alterations. As for those accomplices Hammett named, according to Wade, none appeared in the original confession. For almost 40 years, Richard C. Wade's argument remained something of an enigma for historians. It was bold but quickly dismissed because of its willingness to go against the official record of the trial by Parker and Kennedy, which has for better or for worse become the definitive historical starting point for all things Denmark Vesey related. In 2001, Michael P. Johnson, then a history professor at Johns Hopkins University, expanded on Wade's argument, arguing that there was no slave conspiracy and that it was all a fabrication created by paranoid whites. As mentioned before, in the aftermath of the Denmark Vesey trial, Charlestonian whites were on high alert. As Johnson wrote in his article, Vesey and his co-conspirators, quote, day after day, militia officials called away men from their jobs and homes to muster, march, patrol, and stand guard. Beating drums and ringing bells summoned and dispatched soldiers, putting ordinary citizens on edge. Was that pealing bell a signal that conflagration had begun? Was that drum roll a call to arms? Were those artillery rounds fired at a black army advancing toward the city? Because of this mass hysteria, Johnson argues that the second round of trials that began in July 1822 were not a legitimate prosecution of the accused, but rather a court-sanctioned crowd pleaser, with the hangings of slaves being the entertainment. William Johnson, Jr., Associate Judge of the Supreme Court and brother-in-law of Governor Thomas Bennett, was highly critical of the circumstances surrounding the trial of the accused. In a highly publicized article, Justice Johnson attempted to cool the hot-headed Charlestonians' bloodthirst for the accused. Justice Johnson called for a free and open process, a process in which the citizens could witness the trials themselves and not be fed a second-hand account through city newspaper clippings and gossip. Despite this plea, Michael P. Johnson concluded the action of the July Session Court was as follows: you want trials, we'll give you trials. In July, as Michael P. Johnson notes, the amount of arrests in the conspiracy skyrocketed. He writes, quote, Arrests started again on July 2nd, the day Vesey and 5 slaves went to the gallows. Arrests continued every day for the next 2.5 weeks, with the exception of 2 days, until the court adjourned its July session on the 26th. By the end of July, 82 alleged conspirators were arrested, doubling the arrest total from June. In conjunction with the arrests, Johnson noted, the court executed 28 more convicted conspirators before the end of the month, more than 4 times the number of hangings that resulted from the June sessions. One of the most damning pieces of evidence Johnson presents is the falsification of records surrounding the trial of the main conspirator himself, Denmark Vesey. In the official report by Parker and Kennedy, Vesey is listed with Colonel G.W. Cross as his counsel. It also describes an official trial, one in which Vesey himself conducted most of his defense without the need of counsel. The manuscript of Vesey's trial, however, offers a different view. Johnson writes, the manuscript transcript contains no mention of a trial of Denmark Vesey. It says nothing about the presence in court of Vesey or G.W. Cross as his counsel. It says nothing about Vesey facing his accusers or questioning them, yet the official record describes dramatic encounters of this sort. Johnson thunderously declares not a single word of testimony from Denmark Vesey exists in the manuscript. If a trial of Denmark Vesey was held, as the official report claims, no sign of it appears in the original manuscript of the court proceedings. In a testament to how ramshackle the June trials were, Johnson points out that in the official report of the trial, William Paul and Joe LaRoche testified against Vesey on June 19th and 20th, with Vesey present in court. Where's the issue in that? Vesey wasn't in custody until June 22nd, the dramatic courtroom theater of the Vesey trials, in which he, quote, addressed the court at considerable length, is in the opinion of Johnson a total farce. I hope that this very long, hopefully detailed enough recounting of the story of Denmark Vesey has laid the groundwork for my own conclusion regarding his story. Personally, I have a hard time believing that Vesey could have planned the insurrection to the scale that is detailed by Douglas Egerton in the official trial report. I do think that there is something being planned, of course. It's not a stretch to assert that given Vesey's religiosity and literacy, he could have transcended rural and urban slave divides to form a coalition of the willing. But the weapons caches, alleged 9,000 slaves that were said to be in on the plot, and how quickly the trials commenced suggest a different story that we will likely never understand or know the full truth of. I can't help but be enthralled by the arguments of Wade and Johnson. For Wade, introducing his argument at such a flashpoint in racial reckoning in American history is something I found both astounding and admirable. Similarly, Johnson's arguments came on the heels of 3 separate books published about Denmark Vesey at the turn of the millennium, one of which is Egerton's book, which I reference a lot in this very essay. The fact that the governor of South Carolina, who was the first target of this insurrection, argued in favor of free and open trials to the accused should immediately raise alarm bells. How about the fact that the only African-American-led church in Charleston was immediately burned down in the wake of the trials, lest we forget the fact that the church had been a target of white Charlestonians before the Vesey plot, or try to debunk, or at the very least contend, the idea that the trials of the Vesey conspirators were kangaroo court trials with public hangings meant to satisfy the bloodlust of whites. I, for one, can't say that the execution of an additional 28 conspirators beside Vesey and his original 5 comrades, one of which who was only exiled, was justified or at the very least lawful in its procedure to declare death upon the accused, because frankly, it wasn't. Consider this as well. In the months after the Vesey trial, James Hamilton, the mayor of Charleston, lobbied the state legislature to pass the Negro Sailors Act of 1822. This act imprisoned free African sailors until their captains paid a fee for their release. If the captain couldn't or refused to pay the fee, then his shipmen would be sold into slavery. This law was yet another wrinkle in the South Carolina legislature that made the Palmetto State the most oppressive to live in as an African slave. It also becomes a topic of interest around a year later, when Justice William Johnson Jr., the same justice who had lambasted the trial proceedings for Denmark Vesey and Co., ruled the Negro Sailors Act unconstitutional. The South Carolina legislature was enraged. Through the 1820s, South Carolina resisted federal enforcement against the Negro Sailors Act, eventually leading to the nullification crisis of 1832. Leading the charge in Washington, D.C. was John C. Calhoun, but on the local level, Governor James Hamilton rallied the legislature to nullify the tariffs of 1828 and 1832. All this is to say that the first cracks in the American Union were directly caused by the South Carolinian threat of secession because of, outwardly, tariffs, but inwardly the preservation of slavery and white hegemony. In my opinion, a direct line can be drawn from the legislators' damage control post-Denmark-Vesey plot to the fracturing of the United States as first caused by the nullification crisis in 1832, led by a bunch of hot-headed South Carolina slave owners. By adopting Andrew Jackson's mantra of "let the Supreme Court enforce their decisions themselves," South Carolina made itself the first state to seriously threaten leaving the Union to protect their interests. All this powder keg needed was a spark, and that spark was lit by the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy. In 1865, after meeting for years in secrecy, the newly emancipated congregants of Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church began to build a new church. The architect of that church was Robert Vesey, son of Denmark and, more importantly, a newly freed man. 150 years after Mother Emanuel was reestablished, a senseless shooting by a white supremacist claimed the lives of 9 African-American parishioners, including pastor and state senator Clementa Pinckney. When the church was burned down in 1822, the African-American community of Charleston was left with no one to turn to. In the face of its greatest tragedy in almost 200 years, Mother Emanuel persisted and triumphed despite the horrific violence inflicted upon it. And instead of being abandoned by the greater Charleston community, Mother Emanuel became a source of racial unity in the days, months, and years after its senseless tragedy.